Archaeologists opened a Chinese tomb, sealed for 3,000 years. What they found inside shocked them. A tomb sealed beneath layers of earth and stone for 3,000 years has finally been opened. Inside, archaeologists found not only ancient artifacts, but also traces that left them speechless. Some human remains were still lying exactly where they had been placed, while the burial objects were still in position, as if the people who once lived here had left only recently. But what moved the experts most was the story of the people whose lives had been erased from history by the passage of time. Hello everyone, welcome back to Ancient History, the channel where we uncover mysteries buried by time and rediscover stories that seem to have vanished forever. As you know, archaeology is not simply about digging a hole and finding a few ancient objects. Every layer of soil that is carefully removed can reveal another piece of the past. A coffin can reveal the social status of a person. A skeleton can tell us how they lived and died. Even a small object placed beside a body can help experts understand the beliefs and customs of an entire ancient community. On today's journey, we're going to look back at strange and haunting archaeological discoveries, from thousands of years old human remains and remarkably well-preserved bodies to aristocratic tombs containing burial objects that have left researchers with countless questions. And the most important thing is that not every mystery has been solved. So what did archaeologists actually find? And can these discoveries help us understand the people who lived thousands of years ago? Let's begin our journey with the first discovery right now. The Zhou Dynasty tomb and the heartbreaking secret of 4 children who were sacrificed. Thousands of years ago, when someone died, the living always sought ways to send them into the afterlife through various burial rituals. Some cultures practiced sky burial, while others chose earth burial, water burial, cremation, or sealing the body in a tomb. But in ancient Chinese history, there was an even more horrifying ritual that few people know about: human sacrifice at burial, in which living people were killed or forced to die so they could accompany the deceased into the afterlife, even though they were still perfectly healthy. And the most heartbreaking part is that some of these victims were children. So, what exactly did this practice involve? And why did people follow such a terrifying custom? To understand more, let's travel to Puyang, Henan Province, China. Because here, during the excavation of a tomb dating to the Zhou Dynasty, roughly from 1046 to 256 BC, archaeologists discovered something that seemed like it belonged only in ancient legends. And it left them stunned. Beneath the 4 corners of the tomb were the remains of 4 children. All 4 skeletons were relatively well preserved and nearly intact, even though none of the children had been placed inside coffins. But it was what experts discovered inside the bones that made the story truly haunting. Research revealed that the remains of all 4 victims contained mercury compounds. This suggests that their deaths were not caused by illness or natural causes. According to the research described in the source material, these children were forced to consume mercury so they could die and follow the tomb's occupant into the afterlife. After their deaths, mercury was also poured over their bodies in an attempt to preserve the remains for a longer period of time. Just think about it. They were still far too young to understand what was happening to them. Yet because of an adult belief, the lives of innocent children were turned into part of a funerary ritual. Cruel, isn't it? So who was the person buried in this tomb? Someone powerful enough to make others die alongside him. An examination of the tomb's structure and scale suggests that the person buried here most likely belonged to the landowning or wealthy aristocratic class during the Zhou Dynasty. In ancient society, some people believed that their power and status did not end when they died. They wanted to take with them everything that had served them during their lifetime, even other human beings. In particular, ancient people sometimes believed that innocent children who had not yet experienced much of the world could serve as messengers connecting the dead with heaven and earth. This belief may have turned innocent children into victims of human sacrifice at burial. In other words, this was not simply a burial ritual. It reflected a world in which power, superstition, and the desire to enjoy an eternal existence after death could sometimes outweigh the value of human life. The practice of human sacrifice at burial is believed to have appeared as early as the Zhou Dynasty and continued through various periods of Chinese history. Over time, however, the ritual increasingly came to be regarded as cruel, inhumane, and contrary to social and moral standards. Eventually, the practice was abolished and strictly banned during the reign of the Kangxi Emperor of the Qing Dynasty. But before it disappeared from history, it had already left countless anonymous victims behind. The 4 children whose remains were discovered in Puyang may represent only a very small fraction of them. And perhaps the most disturbing question to consider when standing before an ancient tomb is not, how wealthy was the person buried inside? But rather, to give one person a life of luxury even after death, how many other people had to pay the price? That may be the real secret buried beneath the seemingly silent layers of history. Terrifying, isn't it, everyone? 18 mysterious bone fragments in a 7,000-year-old tomb in China leave experts stunned. Some ancient tombs leave archaeologists amazed because of the valuable objects buried inside. But there are also tombs that contain no gold or precious treasures at all, yet leave researchers spending years trying to answer a single question. Why was the dead person buried in such a strange way? And a discovery in Lindong District, Xi'an, Shanxi Province, China, presented experts with exactly this kind of question. The story began in 1995, when workers were constructing a highway and unexpectedly unearthed several pottery objects along with stone artifacts. At first, they looked like nothing more than fragments of old objects buried deep underground. But to people with archaeological experience, even a few artifacts like these could be enough to suggest that something far more important might be hidden beneath the surface. And as it turned out, they were right. As soon as they received the report, archaeologists quickly arrived at the site. After examining the remains, they determined that the artifacts were indeed associated with an ancient tomb dating back approximately 7,000 years. Fortunately, the tomb appeared to have never been disturbed by grave robbers. As a result, the burial goods remained relatively intact, including pottery and stone tools. Everything seemed fairly straightforward, until experts began examining the human remains inside. Initial findings indicated that the person buried there was a young girl who died at only around 14 or 15 years old. She had barely entered her teenage years, yet her life had ended approximately 7,000 years ago. Then, an unusual detail emerged. The skeleton contained 18 additional bone fragments. At this point, the story became difficult to understand. Who did those bones belong to? Were they part of the girl's own skeleton? Or were they the bones of another person or an animal that had been placed inside the tomb? And most importantly, why were they found beside her remains? These are exactly the kinds of questions that make archaeology so fascinating. A skeleton cannot speak. There are no written records describing what happened. There are no witnesses. Researchers can only rely on the position of each bone, traces left on the body, and the surviving objects around it to gradually reconstruct the story. According to a hypothesis proposed based on the research findings, the girl may have violated a strict marriage rule within her community, and because of this, she may have received an extremely harsh punishment. She is believed to have had her ribs broken. Afterward, members of the tribe allegedly used 18 sharp implements made from animal bone and drove them into her body. Ultimately, these injuries may have caused her death. Of course, this is an interpretation based on archaeological evidence and research hypotheses, not a story in which every detail can be confirmed with absolute certainty. But if this hypothesis is correct, then this 7,000-year-old skeleton is telling an incredibly tragic story. A girl who was only around 14 or 15 years old may have paid for violating a social rule within her community with her own life. Today, a girl that age might be attending school, spending time with friends, and beginning to dream about her future. But in this ancient community, an act considered a violation of social rules may have brought a young life to a painful end. Of course, when discussing discoveries from thousands of years ago, we must be extremely cautious. A blood-red skeleton reveals the final moments of a man. You know, some disasters take only minutes to wipe out an entire city, yet it can take thousands of years for modern humans to understand what truly happened. And Herculaneum, an ancient town in Italy, is one place that preserves a story like this. Nearly 2,000 years after Mount Vesuvius erupted, archaeologists continue to dig deeper into the layers of earth that once buried this place, and eventually, their painstaking work was rewarded. In an ancient coastal area, they discovered a skeleton with such a distinctive color that, at first glance, many people might have thought it was blood. A blood-red skeleton. Its owner was identified as a man who died at approximately 40 to 45 years old. He was one of thousands of victims of the catastrophic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. If you have ever heard of Pompeii, you probably already know that Vesuvius was no ordinary volcano. When it awakened, enormous quantities of volcanic material and ash poured down over the surrounding settlements. Pompeii was buried, and Herculaneum suffered the same fate. But what makes the tragedy even more terrifying is that the people living there had almost no chance to understand what was happening. Within a short period of time, a city that had been living normally was transformed into a world frozen in time. People who were working were buried. Those who were trying to escape could not run any farther. Families desperately searching for a way out were permanently trapped beneath layers of ash and volcanic debris. And the man in this story appears to have tried to run toward the shoreline. The location where his remains were discovered led experts to consider a particularly interesting possibility. He may have been very close to the sea when the disaster struck. Perhaps he believed that if he could just run a little farther, he might escape the danger zone. There is even a theory that he may have been a soldier attempting to reach and rescue people who were trapped. But fate never gave him that chance. After examining the remains, experts proposed that the man may have been struck by a collapsing wooden roof, causing his skull to fracture. Then, the extreme heat from the volcanic material, along with ash and debris, quickly covered his body. If that is what truly happened, then he did not simply die from being buried. Instead, he may have spent his final moments in a desperate attempt to escape. But there was another question that attracted even more attention from experts. Why was the skeleton red? Further analysis suggested that the red coloration was associated with the victim's blood. After the man died, his blood dried and adhered to the bones. Under the unusual environmental conditions created by the volcanic disaster, the pigment may have been preserved, causing the remains to take on their unusual red coloration. So what we see today is not simply a skeleton that changed color. It may be the final trace of a human body that was caught in one of the most famous natural disasters of the ancient world. What is remarkable is that Vesuvius did not simply destroy lives, it also unintentionally preserved a part of the ancient Roman world. Roads, houses, everyday objects, footprints, human bodies, all were buried beneath layers of volcanic material. And that very destruction gave future generations an extraordinary opportunity to see what life was like nearly 2,000 years ago. 76. Sacrificed children reveal the dark secret of the Xiongnu. There is a place in Peru where every time archaeologists dig into the ground, they are confronted with a story that is difficult to comprehend. Not gold, not silver, and not ancient statues, but hundreds of children's remains lying beneath the dry soil of the coastal region. That place is Pampa La Cruz, Peru, an archaeological site closely associated with the sacrificial rituals of the Xiongnu civilization. During an excavation there, archaeologists discovered another 76 sets of children's remains buried in mass graves. This number drew particular attention from researchers because many other children's remains had already been discovered in the area, bringing the total to 303 cases. Yes, you heard that right. 303 children. That number alone is enough to make us stop and think. Who were these children? Why were they brought here? And what could have driven an ancient community to carry out such horrifying rituals? The research indicates that the remains discovered at Pampa La Cruz were associated with the Xiongnu civilization, a pre-Inca culture that flourished along the coast of Peru and extended into parts of what is now Ecuador. The Xiongnu built a highly developed kingdom. Their center of power was Chan, a major urban center that played an important political role before the Inca rose to dominate the region. If we look only at these achievements, we might imagine the Xiongnu as a highly organized society. They developed irrigation systems to bring water from the mountains down to their agricultural fields. They knew how to extract and work metals. Xiongnu artisans created intricate objects made from gold, silver, and copper using highly sophisticated techniques. The civilization reached its greatest height between approximately the 12th and 15th centuries before being conquered and gradually absorbed by the Inca Empire. Yet behind this advanced civilization existed a ritual that continues to send chills through people today. That ritual was child sacrifice. Pampa La Cruz is located approximately 155 miles southeast of Chan. According to researchers, it is one of the largest known archaeological sites associated with the sacrifice of children ever discovered. What makes the site particularly remarkable is that excavations there have continued to produce new discoveries, dozens of skeletons, then dozens more, and each time another layer of earth is removed, another piece of the story emerges. But there is one detail that has particularly captured the attention of experts. Small footprints were discovered at the site. These footprints raise the heartbreaking possibility that some of the children may have actually walked from Chan Chan to Pampa La Cruz before the ritual took place. Try to imagine that journey, tiny footsteps crossing the dry landscape. The children may not have known where they were being taken, or perhaps they believed they were participating in an important ritual for their community. Isn't that heartbreaking? And the story does not end there. Experts have also reported that the Xiongnu carried out child sacrifice rituals involving victims approximately 4 to 14 years old. The sacrifices are believed to have been intended to appease the gods and seek protection, favorable weather, rainfall, and successful harvests. This is what makes the story so deeply paradoxical. The Xiongnu needed water to sustain their agriculture. They built an entire irrigation system to control and distribute their water supply. Yet when nature failed to provide what they needed, religious beliefs may have led them to turn children into sacrificial offerings. A civilization could create magnificent structures, produce highly sophisticated metalwork, and develop a complex social system, while at the same time maintaining rituals that we cannot accept today. And it is precisely the remains at Pampa La Cruz that have allowed archaeologists to see this darker side. The heartbreaking truth is that we can study the bones, footprints, burial locations, and other surviving traces, but we cannot know exactly what those children were thinking during their final hours. Perhaps they were afraid. Perhaps they believed they were doing something sacred. Or perhaps they simply could not understand why they had to die. A 2,000-year-old skeleton with the mysterious smile of a chieftain. Hey, imagine this. If you were to uncover an ancient tomb one day, what would catch your attention the most? A piece of gold, an ancient sword, or a remarkably intact skeleton? All of those would certainly be fascinating, right? But you know what? For archaeologists, things can be very different. This time, in Astrakhan Oblast, Russia, they encountered something far more unusual. A roughly 2,000-year-old male skeleton with almost perfectly preserved teeth, creating the impression that the dead man was actually smiling. Sounds hard to believe, doesn't it? But the story behind this skeleton is even more fascinating than its strange appearance. The discovery began when a Russian farmer named Rustam Mudayev accidentally uncovered an ancient tomb. After experts examined the remains, they determined that the tomb contained the skeleton of a man with a deformed skull. Despite having been buried for approximately 2,000 years, his teeth were remarkably well preserved. It was those teeth that made the skeleton look as though it were wearing a strange smile. Of course, the man was not actually smiling in the way we understand it today. It was simply the result of the preservation of the remains and the position of the jaw after thousands of years. But if that were all there was to the discovery, it might not have attracted quite so much attention. What really caught the experts' attention was what had been buried alongside the man. Around the skeleton, they found a collection of jewelry and valuable artifacts, including gold objects, a gold belt buckle decorated with turquoise, knives, daggers, and most remarkably, a small golden horse head placed between his legs. So, could an ordinary person have been buried with so many valuable objects? Probably not. These clues led experts to suspect that the man may have been a high-status figure in ancient society, possibly even a Sarmatian chieftain, a nomadic people who once controlled parts of the territory corresponding to modern-day Russia. Georgy Stukalov, a scientific researcher at the Astrakhan Museum of History, suggested that the site may have been a burial ground reserved for the aristocracy or powerful families among the ancient nomadic communities. And the way the man was buried further supports this theory. He was placed inside a wooden coffin, with his head elevated above the rest of his body. From the outside, it almost looked as though the man were sleeping on a pillow. This is a particularly interesting detail, because the way a body was positioned inside a tomb was not always random. It could reflect funerary rituals, social status, or the community's beliefs about the deceased. But the story does not end there. Near the tomb, archaeologists also discovered the remains of a woman buried with a bronze mirror, a sheep-shaped offering, and several stone objects. Not far away was another tomb belonging to an older man. Inside, archaeologists found a horse-head ornament crafted from silver and bronze. When all these discoveries are considered together, a picture of a wealthy Sarmatian community gradually begins to emerge. There were people of high social status, there were distinctive burial rituals, there were gold objects, there were horse symbols, and there were offerings placed in the graves alongside the dead. For ancient nomadic societies, horses were far more than a means of transportation. They could be associated with power, warfare, social status, and even spiritual beliefs. Because of this, the golden horse head placed inside the tomb may have held a special meaning for its owner. But what continues to capture people's attention the most is the face. The skull was deformed, the flesh had disappeared long ago, yet the teeth remained almost completely intact. Viewed from a certain angle, those teeth create the impression of a smile that has survived for approximately 2,000 years. Strange, isn't it? This was a man who lived thousands of years ago. He may have ridden horses across vast grasslands, commanded others, or possessed valuable objects. Then, one day, he died and was placed inside a carefully prepared tomb. Time took everything away. His clothing disappeared, his flesh disappeared. Even his name was gradually forgotten, but his teeth remained. And those teeth unintentionally created an expression that gives people today the strange feeling that this man is still smiling. Of course, the skeleton is not actually smiling. It is simply the way the remaining structure of the skull and teeth creates that impression. But perhaps that is exactly what makes this discovery so special. Among thousands of anonymous human remains, the skeleton in Astrakhan seems to leave us with something deeply human, a smile from the past. And behind that smile lies the story of a chieftain, a nomadic community, and an entire ancient world that disappeared long ago. Yet history has preserved something. Not his voice, not his face, but his bones, his burial objects, and a set of teeth that remained intact for 2,000 years. Two 6,000-year-old skeletons with intact teeth reveal the secret of an ancient burial island in Brazil. You know, archaeology is truly fascinating. Some discoveries are completely ordinary and hardly worth noticing. But there are also discoveries that make people stop and stare the moment they see them. Not because they are filled with gold, silver, or rare treasures, but because something that seems almost impossible to survive for thousands of years has remained remarkably intact. In Santa Catarina State, Brazil, archaeologists encountered exactly such a case. Two skeletons dating back approximately 6,000 years, with their teeth still almost completely preserved. What makes the discovery even more remarkable is that the skeletons were not buried deep underground. They were found only about 24 inches below the surface, during construction work along BR 470 in the municipality of Elhoda, Brazil. At first, it was simply an ordinary construction site. But as the soil was removed, traces of ancient human activity suddenly emerged, revealing a story that had been buried for thousands of years. When experts examined the remains, they were astonished by the condition of the two skeletons. The bones were still relatively well preserved, especially the nearly intact teeth. For human remains approximately 6,000 years old, this was truly remarkable. If you looked only at the teeth, it might be difficult to believe that they belonged to people who lived during a time when there was no written language, no modern cities, and human life depended almost entirely on nature. So who were these people? And why were their remains buried in this particular place? The answer may lie in the area's ancient landscape. According to researchers, the location where the two skeletons were discovered may once have been an island surrounded by a lagoon. The area is believed to have been relatively isolated in the past and may have served as both a place of habitation and a burial site for ancient communities. Archaeologist Valdir Luiz Schwengbert of the University of Southern Santa Catarina reported that the two skeletons were located approximately 24 inches below the ground. According to him, the area was relatively isolated in ancient times and, most importantly, did not have an easily accessible source of drinking water. So why did people continue to come here? One clue may lie in what these ancient people ate. Archaeological evidence indicates that the inhabitants of the area consumed various types of fish, including catfish, snapper, and flounder. Interestingly, most of the fish remains discovered were relatively small, suggesting that much of their food may have come from young fish living in shallow waters. From these traces, experts began piecing together a picture of the community that once lived here. The two individuals who were buried there may have belonged to one of the communities referred to in some sources as the Jiquabu people, who lived in Brazil for an extremely long period, from approximately 10,000 years ago through the colonial period. The earliest evidence associated with these communities is believed to date back approximately 10,000 years in the Minas Gerais highlands of Brazil. Some experts have even proposed that these ancient groups may have been connected to waves of hunter-gatherers who migrated from Asia into the Americas across the Bering Strait. By the time Portuguese explorers arrived in Brazil, the region was still home to numerous indigenous communities. So, the two skeletons lying beneath only 24 inches of soil are not simply the remains of two people who died 6,000 years ago. A 400-year-old noblewoman buried with her husband's heart, evidence of undying love. A marriage may come to an end when one person dies, but in Rennes, France, researchers uncovered a story suggesting that some bonds may continue even after both people have left this world. This is the story of Louise de Quengo, a woman from the French nobility who lived during the 17th century. Her remains were discovered during the excavation of an ancient burial site in Rennes. After conducting their research, experts determined that Louise de Quengo died around 1656 at the age of at least 65. She was the wife of Toussaint Parien, a nobleman and knight of Brefaillac who had died before her in 1649. But what made this discovery so extraordinary was not Louise's identity. It was what was found at her feet. It was her husband's heart. At this point, you are probably wondering, why would a man's heart be found inside his wife's tomb? The answer may lie in the burial customs of European nobility during that period. In medieval and early modern European society, when a person died, their heart was sometimes removed from the body and buried separately from the rest of their remains. For some noble families, the heart could carry a special meaning, representing affection, family lineage, or the desire to rest alongside loved ones. And in the case of Louise de Quengo, Toussaint Parien's heart was placed directly inside his wife's final resting place. But that was not the only remarkable detail. Experts also discovered that Louise de Quengo's coffin was made of lead. Over time, this gave the coffin its distinctive greenish appearance. Thanks to this unusual preservation environment, her body essentially became a form of natural mummy, allowing many details of her remains to remain clearly identifiable after hundreds of years. Louise's clothing was also remarkably well preserved. She wore an outer robe, with a dress made of serge wool underneath, a collarless bodice, and leather shoes with thin soles. Her face was covered with a burial shroud, while her head was covered with a hood. Every tiny detail is almost like a snapshot of the life of a noblewoman who lived hundreds of years ago. But then experts discovered something else that made the story even more mysterious. Louise's skull had been opened. Her brain appears to have been removed after her death, but researchers have still not determined with certainty why this was done. One possibility is that it may have been related to a funerary or body processing ritual practiced during that period. And there was more. Louise de Quengo's body also appears to have undergone a similar procedure involving her heart. After she died, her heart was removed from her chest, and the opening was then stitched closed. Her heart was subsequently preserved separately, much like her husband's. This made the discovery even more remarkable. It appears that even after the two had died, their hearts were treated in a way that allowed them to remain connected to one another. Toussaint Parien's heart was one of the 4 best-preserved hearts ever discovered in Rennes, remaining almost completely intact after centuries beneath the ground. From an emotional perspective, this burial arrangement almost seems like a message. Their bodies may have rested in 2 different places, but their hearts were brought back together. And perhaps that is what makes this discovery so extraordinary. We often think archaeology is only about wars, kings, or civilizations that have disappeared. But sometimes, a single heart placed at the feet of a wife can tell the story of a love that survived for hundreds of years. Louise de Quengo lay peacefully inside her lead coffin for centuries. Time took away her name, her life, and the world she once knew. But when her tomb was finally opened, archaeologists discovered something deeply human. Some people, even after death, still wanted their hearts to remain beside the person they loved. A truly touching discovery, don't you think? An intact body in an ancient coffin in China forced an entire construction site to shut down. A construction site that seemed to contain nothing more than dirt, rocks, and the sound of heavy machinery suddenly came to a halt after workers dug into the ground and discovered an ancient coffin containing the remarkably well-preserved body of a man. Sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? But this was a real discovery, documented in Hunan Province, China. During construction work in the area, workers unexpectedly uncovered a coffin buried underground. When experts arrived and examined it, they quickly realized that this was no ordinary coffin. Inside was the remarkably well-preserved body of a man, believed to have died sometime during the Ming or Qing dynasty, meaning he had been buried hundreds of years ago. So what allowed this body to survive for so long? The answer may have been hidden in the coffin itself. Experts discovered that the man had been buried inside a coffin constructed from a combination of limestone and fine wood. This unusual structure may have created conditions that helped prevent the body from decomposing too quickly. As a result, when the coffin was opened, researchers still had the opportunity to observe traces that time would normally have erased centuries ago. But the more experts examined the burial, the more reason they had to question the identity and social status of the person inside. Based on initial assessments, the man may have belonged to the aristocratic class or at least come from a relatively wealthy family. In ancient Chinese society, an elaborately prepared tomb accompanied by burial objects often reflected the social status of the deceased. Interestingly, the mountain where the coffin was discovered was reportedly associated with a family surnamed Wang. This detail made researchers even more eager to investigate the origins of the tomb and the relationship between the deceased and the surrounding area. Experts had to move the coffin and the body extremely carefully because even a single careless movement could damage valuable traces that had survived for hundreds of years. And then, a small object beside the body made the story even more intriguing. The man had been buried with a fan. Today, a fan might seem like nothing more than an ordinary household item. But if it remained beside its owner for hundreds of years, it becomes an important archaeological clue. The fan could provide insights into the person's social status, daily habits, lifestyle, or even the burial customs of the community in which he lived. However, a single object is not enough to determine his identity with certainty. Think about it. Who was this man to have been buried with such care? What kind of life did he live? Was he an aristocrat, a wealthy individual, or simply someone who held a special position within his community? For now, these questions still require further research before they can be answered with certainty. Because of the importance of the discovery, construction activities in the area were suspended, allowing experts to conduct a more thorough excavation and investigation. A coffin made of limestone and wood, a remarkably intact human body, a fan lying beside the deceased. Together, these objects seem like pieces of a story that time had locked away for centuries. And the most fascinating part is that we may have only just opened the first door to that mystery. Everyone. A 500-year-old skeleton still wearing its leather boots, found face down beneath the mud of the River Thames. Hey, imagine you're walking along a riverbank when you suddenly notice a skeleton lying beneath the mud. What do you think your reaction would be? You'd probably run as far away as possible because you wouldn't want to get into trouble, right? But archaeologists in London, England, didn't run away. They moved closer to investigate, and what surprised them most wasn't simply the skeleton itself, but a pair of leather boots still intact on the feet of a man who had died approximately 500 years ago. It sounds unbelievable, but this was a real archaeological discovery. The story unfolded during research conducted as part of London's Super Sewer Tunnel project. There, experts from Mola Headland discovered a skeleton buried deep within the mud of the River Thames. At first, no one knew how long the remains had been lying beneath the mud. It was only after the skeleton was recovered, cleaned, and analyzed that experts determined that it belonged to a man. But it was his position that really caught everyone's attention. The man was lying completely face down in the mud, with one arm raised over his head and his face turned to one side. Looking at the scene, you might almost think he had fallen there only minutes earlier, rather than being someone who had been lying there for hundreds of years. So, what happened? How did he die? That was the question archaeologists had to answer. After examining the skeleton, they found no signs indicating that the man had been attacked or suffered a serious injury before his death. There was also no clear evidence that the remains had been damaged afterward. As a result, one possibility was an accident. The man may have slipped, fallen into the muddy area along the river, and been unable to escape. It is also possible that he fell into the water and drowned, after which his body became covered in mud and was gradually buried within the unique environment of the River Thames. Experts estimate that the man may have died sometime in the late 1400s or early 1500s AD. That means he had been lying beneath London's mud for approximately 500 years. But the story doesn't end there. What made this discovery truly remarkable was the pair of boots. The man's clothing had almost completely decomposed over time. Yet the knee-high leather boots he was wearing when he died had survived remarkably well. Just think about it. 500 years ago, why would a man have been wearing these boots while walking along the River Thames? Perhaps he was working. Perhaps he was heading somewhere. Or maybe he was simply on his way home. Then something unexpected happened, and his life ended right there. No one knows exactly what happened. We don't know his name, where he came from, or who his family was. But the boots have unintentionally become the very thing that helps modern people imagine what his life may have been like. And this is one of the fascinating things about archaeology. Gold, silver, and precious treasures aren't always the most valuable discoveries. Sometimes, an ordinary object can tell us an entire story. In this case, the mud of the River Thames accidentally preserved the leather boots for hundreds of years, allowing them to survive far longer than the clothing that surrounded them. So when we look at the skeleton, we shouldn't think of it simply as a person who died 500 years ago. Try to think about it in a simpler way. He was once a living person, walking on those very feet and wearing those very boots, until one day, an accident happened and no one was able to save him. 500 years later, archaeologists finally found him. And strangely enough, the clearest thing left behind to tell his story was the very pair of boots he had worn during the final days of his life. Everyone. 2 gilt silver dragons in a Xiongnu tomb, a 2,000-year-old treasure that surprised archaeologists. There is something fascinating about ancient tombs like these. The deeper you dig, the more likely you are to encounter things that are completely different from what you expected. And inside an aristocratic Xiongnu tomb in Mongolia, archaeologists encountered exactly such a discovery. Among numerous weapons, pieces of jewelry, and everyday objects from the ancient world, they unexpectedly found 2 strangely shaped dragon figures. What makes them especially remarkable is that these dragons were not made of gold, as many people might assume. Instead, they were crafted from silver and then covered with a layer of gold. After nearly 2,000 years, they were still remarkable enough to capture the attention of experts. The discovery was made in northern Mongolia, an area that was once an important homeland of the Xiongnu, an ancient nomadic people who wielded significant influence across the Eurasian steppes. During archaeological surveys and excavations, Chinese and Mongolian archaeologists worked together to investigate an ancient burial complex. There, they identified a tomb belonging to a Xiongnu aristocrat, estimated to date to approximately AD 25. And the more they explored, the clearer it became that the person buried inside was certainly no ordinary individual. Inside the tomb were numerous burial goods, ranging from jade belt hooks and jewelry to wooden cups. Archaeologists also discovered leather horse harnesses, household objects, chariots, and various types of weapons. Looking at the quantity and variety of these objects, we can begin to imagine the status of the tomb's owner. Someone belonging to the aristocracy clearly would not have received the same burial as an ordinary member of society. Yet among all these objects, 2 artifacts particularly captured the experts' attention. They were 2 silver dragons. When you hear the word dragon, you might immediately picture the familiar golden dragons of East Asian culture. But the 2 artifacts discovered here looked very different. Analysis showed that they were cast in silver and coated with a layer of gold on the outside. The ancient craftsmen had carefully shaped horns, eyes, teeth, and feather-like details along the bodies of the figures. Every line and feature was crafted with considerable precision, suggesting that their maker possessed a high level of skill. What surprised archaeologists even more was that these were believed to be the first ancient dragon figures with such distinctive forms discovered in an excavated Xiongnu aristocratic tomb. So, what were these 2 dragons used for? That is the fascinating question raised by these small artifacts. They may have been decorative objects, symbolic items, or perhaps connected to the beliefs and status of the person buried in the tomb. However, based solely on their appearance, it is impossible to determine their original meaning with certainty. What we do know is that the two dragons provide us with another glimpse into the culture, art, and daily life of the Xiongnu aristocracy nearly 2,000 years ago. Just think about it. After lying silently underground for more than a dozen centuries, objects made of jade, leather, and wood, along with weapons and chariots, have all preserved traces of a world that disappeared long ago. But standing out above all of them are the two gilt silver dragons. They are not only strangely beautiful, but also raise questions about the cultural exchanges and beliefs of the ancient Xiongnu. And perhaps it is precisely because we still cannot fully explain everything about these two artifacts that they have become one of the most intriguing discoveries found inside a Xiongnu aristocratic tomb in Mongolia. Dear friends, we've just explored a series of astonishing archaeological discoveries, where every skeleton, every tomb, and every small artifact tells another part of the story of the past. Some mysteries have been solved, while others remain buried beneath the layers of time, waiting for someone to uncover their secrets. So, which discovery impressed you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy mysterious stories like these, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Ancient History channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. For now, goodbye, and I'll see you again in our next archaeological discoveries.